In this episode, I am once again joined by Dr. Anthony Metivier, author and internationally renowned memory expert, whose meditation practice is reciting sacred Sanskrit texts from memory. Anthony shares his own language learning journey, including his childhood struggles learning French to later success with languages such as German, Mandarin, Latin, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. Anthony describes the 5 levels of processing and reveals how he uses his expertise in the art of memory to fast-track language acquisition, including strategies to optimize progress in vocabulary, grammar, and comprehension. Anthony challenges popular theories of comprehensible input, criticises gamified language learning apps, and reveals his #1 secret to success in foreign language study. So without further ado, Dr. Anthony Metivier. Anthony Metivier, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
I'm so pleased to talk with you again. And today we're going to dive into a very interesting topic. And we've touched on it in previous episodes, but here we're going to put it in the focus. And that is languages and the way in which you apply your memory expertise, as well as your approach to life and learning in general, to the particular topic of learning languages. So I know you have quite a number of perhaps at first counterintuitive approaches and ways of seeing this topic. So I'm very excited to discuss this with you. But I wonder if we might begin, first of all, with your history of language learning, foreign language learning. Which languages have you studied? What's been your arc throughout your life in terms of that process?
Yes. Well, I have a very quirky view of language as such. So I would say that I am not, and people point this out to me all the time, I'm not particularly fluent in English. So just after we were talking about this by email, someone corrected me on my pronunciation of the primacy effect. I really have no idea how else that one would pronounce that, but apparently it's absolutely incorrect. And last week there were endless arguments, or maybe 2 weeks ago, on the Art of Memory forum about how that we should all just get together and agree to pronounce loci the way that the poster on the forum thinks that it should be pronounced. And, when you look in Latin, there's different ways of rendering that term depending on the grammar. And most of them would have a hard K sound, but he was quite convinced that it should be loci or loci, but definitely never loci. And yeah, so I get corrected on this all the time. Like I have comments all the time. Apparently I don't pronounce nuclear properly either. And yeah, so I'm not fluent in English. I'm a very weird person to speak about language learning with because I don't even believe that there is such a thing as fluency. But in terms of my journey with language, I'm a person who never believed I would be able to learn any language. And that is partly coming out of the experiences I had as a kid. So I had been in French immersion when I was very, very young. And my father is Quebecois and spoke French all my life. But I was pulled out of it when my parents divorced. And I got a very strong aversion to language learning because whether this is an accurate memory or not, I don't know. But I remember being told you will never learn that language of, some common expletive used for French Canadians in Canada. And it really stuck with me. And it made it a very weird relationship to that language and languages as such for a very long time. So anyway, when it comes to PhD time, I have to learn a language because there's a requirement around this and yada, yada, yada. So I pick the one that is the revenge language, which is Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, because part of this early experience has to do with church upbringing. And already I'm in the world of slowly or quickly becoming a militant atheist. And it just seems like the best thing to do, to be able to study this language in particular, because my PhD had to do with classical languages. And so, there was Latin and Greek and biblical Hebrew professors in the program and so forth. So anyway, I picked that and I got myself a biblical Hebrew teacher. And I was just around that time learning mnemonics. And my tutor at that time was always just like, how are you doing this? Like, how can you how can you even get that close to pronunciation with these sorts of things? And I said, well, I guess it's because I'm a musician and I just hear it because I was listening to a lot of recordings. Anyway, that was a mission-oriented thing, and I never looked back at really any of those languages except for Latin until recently. And it just happened that I wound up in Germany. Well, actually, I had studied German, so to speak, in university because I took courses, fourth year undergrad courses, with Mark Weber, who taught Kafka, and Professor Wolfgang Ahrens, who taught Brecht. So there was like some light study of German before I ever wound up in Germany. Then I was in Germany and I sat in, I did the requirement for getting permanent residence, which I think it's 635 hours or something like that, where you have classroom time. And I learned nothing, absolutely, like almost no German at all, for reasons we could get into. But I left that class in bad shape. Then I really started to learn German when I started to understand what is involved in language learning. And from then on, it was smooth sailing. But it was ultimately a mission-oriented situation, because I also had the opportunity to lecture in German. And there's like no way that you're going to do that without, actually putting in some time to study the language. And then beyond that, there's my Sanskrit adventures, which it's not really language learning. There's a stunt where I passed level 3 in Mandarin, and I got some distance in Mandarin, but I ultimately abandoned it one day because my wife said to me, I was like, oh, I got to take another class, or, because I did level 3 and now I got to go do 4 and all this. And she just said to me, she said, I don't really care if we speak Chinese or not. And so I dropped it completely, or almost completely. I still memorize things now and then that just sound cool, and we still talk in Mandarin almost every day. But I've had deskilling in the level that I got to, just because we hardly use it. And I stopped memorizing the Heart Sutra in Mandarin that I was doing at the time, because it was just like, well, if we're never going to really like develop to talking philosophy, then why indeed bother? So then there's Sanskrit, and then there's just developing Latin at the moment. And then there's just preparatory things, going to Greece. So we'll spend some time learning enough about Greek to have some small talk and annoy the help at various restaurants or in Spain or what have you. So yeah, lots of mission-oriented adventures more than anything. But I would say I've never, even though I passed tests, I've never experienced fluency even in English, and I have failed English tests. I like in the early days of the internet, trying to make it online, as they say. I tried to be an editor and do freelance work on some of these websites that will give you tests, and I regularly failed what I was supposed to be able to do in English, and I thought that was just hilarious. Because even then I already had a book that was selling on the market, and it was a great thing to see just how little I know about the language that I was able to start making a living based on, and already had as a professor, that was just on the strength of writing. So that's my adventures in a nutshell.
Very interesting. It sounds like you had some kind of paradigm shift in Germany. I'm quite curious about that. But I'm also curious beforehand about what it was you were able to pull off in Hebrew class that impressed your teacher so much. Was it just your ability to reproduce the sounds, or were you using the mnemonics already to memorize grammar paradigms, vocabulary, etc.? How were you using your memory techniques at that time? And then what was the paradigm shift you later had in Germany?
Basically, the goal in university was there's going to be a textual analysis test. So I just tried to memorize as much of the Bible as I could. And it would have been so much easier if I knew then what I know now about memory techniques. But that's what my tutor was impressed by, is the recitation of the text. In the same way that a lot of people can these days be quite impressed by my Sanskrit. I mean, I'm always astonished when people say, wow, your Sanskrit pronunciation is good. And I'm like, well, you actually know Sanskrit enough to judge its pronunciation? And then, I hear from so many Sanskritists, it's like this, not that. And then I go, oh my God, I've done it wrong and so forth. But nonetheless, and in language learning, people will give you lots and lots of praise that is undue, just simply because it's kind of astonishing to see somebody produce any amount of memorized material. But yeah, working with grammar tables and all that sort of stuff is really not rocket science. It can be confusing because a lot of people restrict what they're doing. But part of the advantage that I had with Hebrew is that I was literally reading. I didn't realize that I was reading, but that's one of the number one things that changed for me in Germany, was that I came to realize that if I'm not reading in German, I am starving myself of several key factors that accelerate everything when you're learning a language. So that was part of the paradigm shift. It was just starting to read, even though I couldn't as well as I would have liked it. Basically wading into that territory and reading and reading and reading is what made the biggest difference. And there's a couple of interesting ways that you can get more reading done. That doesn't have to be, trying to beat yourself over the head with Thomas Munn or something like that. Which I did, and it didn't work very well because that's a specific kind of German, so to speak.
So let's talk about that paradigm shift. What was the before paradigm, and what was the after paradigm in terms of language learning that happened to you? You already said reading, something to do perhaps with comprehensible input. And so what is it what was the epiphany in the paradigm shift that happened?
I think the comprehensible input stuff is quite contentious. It was more incomprehensible input and being willing to wade through it with consistency. So I don't even know what the theory of comprehensible input is meant to mean. It's quite puzzling to me. I don't understand it, because how is it comprehensible? The whole point is that you have to expose yourself to the things that are incomprehensible. So when is it ever comprehensible? And I know there's all kinds of discussion about it, but I find it quite puzzling, actually. I think it actually needs at least 5 levels of processing. And there is a thing called levels of processing. I think Craig and Ferguson introduced it in 72 or something like this. And those 5 levels of processing when it comes to language learning is reading, writing, speaking, listening, and remembering. Or you could change remembering to dedicated memorizing. And that's where I've had an advantage, is that I can memorize stuff. And it gets even stronger when you have the other levels of processing, because you have the reading, the writing, the speaking, and the listening, and this ongoing memorization. So it becomes almost like you create a luminous detail. This is the Poundian concept. Pound himself was, of course, one of these mission-oriented language learners who would, get good enough in order to make these translations and so forth. And the luminous detail is that you start to actually triangulate it to such an extent that you can understand what's going on, even if you don't understand every word, which is quite an important principle. So this is where I also have this kind of mini battle with the comprehensible input stuff, because to this day, I can comprehend all kinds of stuff that my wife is talking about when actually I comprehend very little, but I can triangulate it, right? And there is still an inordinate number of inaccuracies, but nonetheless, it's in this good enough sort of field. So that's really important about, and I think reading gets you there quite a lot faster, simply because you get a lot of comfort with just dealing with stuff you're not really understanding, while you're getting spaced repetition of things that you are memorizing deliberately. And there are some metrics that I came up with to avoid overwhelm and so forth, such as never asking myself to memorize more than 3 words per page. Which sounds to a lot of people, they're just like, well, how are you ever going to memorize thousands of words if you're only working at that pace? And the reality is that you're going to memorize them one at a time, whether it's 10,000 or 3 or 6 or 95, whatever it is. Memorization, whether it's through flashcards or it's through spaced repetition software or it's through memory palace work, well, there's a contradiction in terms, because you can memorize more than one word at a time if you memorize phrases and you allow yourself to not understand necessarily every single word in the phrase. So it scales one way or the other. But at the end of the day, it still is like one thing at a time, basically. And that willingness to do that. So a lot of people choose overwhelm instead of scaling down to this bare minimum. And so that's what I did a lot in reading, even when I was doing in Mandarin. Like, it's just reading Sherlock Holmes in Mandarin in a graded reader may have few words on the page, but it's still, if you allow yourself, it's like an overwhelming amount of words, 30 words per page or 50 or whatever it would be. If you're just sort of willing to use what I call the marginalia dot and just put do, 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 and you don't actually circle the word. You don't even know what word it is that you've chosen necessarily, which is another level of memory exercise, because you put the dot in the margin and then you say, well, which was that word that I'm going to look up later? So you're reading, you choose the word that's most interesting to you for whatever reason. And then after you're done your reading exercise, you go back, you get a little bit of memory exercise from trying to figure out what was the word in that sentence. And then you focus on that. And then, there's the benefit of rereading after memorization, so that you have placed some information in a memory palace, or you're using flashcards or whatever you're doing. And then you go back and reread it, which gives you what I would call natural spaced repetition, insofar as it's not some software just beating you over the head with an algorithm that says review, review, review. You're reviewing it in context with, this would be maybe the comprehensible input stuff. You've already spent some time comprehending it, and now the comprehensive input is more comprehensible because of the introductory layer that you've established.
So let's approach it a different way then. Sometimes language learning is divided up into beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels of progress. And of course, there's a somewhat arbitrary distinctions, and we can slice that up however we like. If you were to approach or advise someone, as I'm sure you do with your clients, advise somebody they need to learn a language, they want to learn a language, whatever the case may be. It could be Sanskrit, Hebrew, German, whatever. And they were to say, all right, how do I start? What's my beginner level strategy? What are the pitfalls to avoid? What regime would you put them on if you were in charge of either yourself or a client? What regime would you put them on as a beginner? And then I'm going to ask the same question about the intermediate plateau, which is notoriously difficult, that great Sahara of intermediate place, and then advanced, okay, we can have a discussion about that too. So what about the beginner? What are most people doing wrong, and how would you avoid that?
Well, I think actually I would start even in a different place, which is, why is the language being learned in the first place? And can you cancel it from your bucket list? Because there's so much desire to learn a language that isn't strong enough to go through what it takes. So that's kind of like a weird way of looking at it, but generally that is where I would advise people to start. And then same thing with intermediate. Okay, so you want to accelerate it, but why, right? And I'm not doing the thing like, oh, your why. If you have a strong enough why, it'll drive you through every obstacle. But really just to think, like, because that's going to help answer the question of what to do. I have to ask this myself, because I have this inkling that I could improve my German by writing translating one of my own books in German, or just writing another one, right? But then it's like, why do I want to do that? Because then I'll have to market it in German, and do I really want to, like, it's just like, why? So if you can get like 5 reasons why together that really make sense, then you go, okay, so those whys help me understand a starting point. And this is really important, because you're going to come across ideas like frequency lists. Oh, these words are used most frequently. One of the biggest problems in the world. Because yes, they're useful. I'm not saying they're not useful, but how do you know that the frequency list put together by some scholar or some website that has learned that Google will give them traffic if they write it in just such a way, or blah, 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 like whatever reason this frequency list is now somehow come to your attention? Like, what does that have to do with you? What does it have to do with your goal? What does it have to do with one of your reasons why you're learning the language, let alone the 5 reasons, right? So you want to have frequency lists in mind, but you also want to have your own list. And there's different ways to develop your own list or multiple lists. So it's like, if it's conversation, what do you say during a day? Rather than someone saying, well, this language uses between 850 and 1100 words. Have you ever recorded yourself and seen how many words you use and what are the things you say? How do you say them? How do you want to express yourself? What are you interested in? What do you expect and anticipate are going to be the kinds of conversations that you have? And then that's that. You focus your goal that way, because some people are going to have different things and they're not going to need to speak in restaurants. They're not going to need to ask about how much a hotel room is. And besides which, these days we use the internet and it's just kind of we book our hotel. And a lot of these books that we come across haven't updated themselves. Some are starting to catch on. They'll have example phrases about, how do I turn on Wi-Fi and so forth. But they've been astonishingly slow to come up to speed with that kind of stuff. In any case, all that aside, let's say that you're hook, line, and sinker. Here we go. The frequency lists can be useful, and I would start with them and get on with a native speaker and tell that person, this is how I intend to memorize this stuff. So whether it's memory palaces or it's going to be flashcards or it's going to be spaced repetition software, just get their take on this kind of stuff. And no matter what they say, make sure you're reading, writing, speaking, and listening in ample doses, as much as you can, as close to immersion as you possibly can, if your goal is to achieve basic fluency in X period of time. If it's just like general familiarity or something like that, I mean, that's its own kettle of fish. And, take a spoon or a bucket to the ocean of the language, like the ocean doesn't care. Do as you please. But native speakers will definitely care, because if you're going to interact with them, there's going to be certain attitudes you'll encounter, like the rolling your eyes, oh, this guy wants to talk to me kind of thing. Or, oh, now it's an opportunity for me to speak English because that person is obviously a native English speaker, or any opportunity that they have to not speak with you will get in the way. I know this because I've had this so many times. It's not even funny. So you got to be prepared for that. And that's why you need a native speaker who you either hire or you trade time with or whatever. So there's that. So then there's the reading regime and trying to figure out what you're going to be able to get yourself to read. Because we know there's no free will. And so, you got to kind of like engineer against the fact that it's going to be very difficult to get yourself to do a thing, especially with the free will issues. But find something that you are going to actually read. And there's never been more material that you could possibly go for. But what I found very useful is to pick what you're interested in as a source for reading. So rather than going to the language learning section and getting these staid, boring, quite scholastic, yawn-inducing stories that have absolutely no relationship to you, whoever you may be, think, and I'll just give my own example, I love music. So I thought, well, which music do I love? And I was in Germany, and I thought, well, I really like Einstürzen und Neubauten. So I found a book of interviews with them, and it was much less painful than the newspaper or the boring classroom storybook. And I picked up so many cool turns of phrase that only cool guys that are in that band would ever use. And, the next thing you know, you have this little dopamine machine because you're speaking with people and you're saying crazy off the wall stuff that is hip and cool and, in this realm. And they're like, whoa, where'd you learn that? And then they want to speak with you in that language because you've got this kind of unique character to yourself. I did it with film studies also, and magic, learning all these things, card magic. I don't mean hermetic magic. So talking to magicians, like what are the words that they use for certain, moves with cards? That stuff it lights your brain on fire because you get much better feedback. So that's really important because a lot of people make language learning so much more tragically boring than it needs to be. So a little inventory. Who am I? What am I interested in? And then how can I find those things? And it'll pull you through. What else? Also, this is not as relevant now as it was for me back then, but there's something of an equivalent now with Netflix and so forth. But finding movies that have the subtitles in that language and trying to mix a bunch of different things together. So the English is spoken, but you're reading the language you're trying to learn. Now we're kind of making a limit here that we're talking about languages that use the Latinate alphabet in this particular case. Because if it's going to be in with kanji and hiragana and katakana, then you got to go and learn all that stuff before that you're going to be making it out, and then it's going to be quite fast. But then let's say that you are doing a character set language, you can take screenshots. You don't have to try to read at the speed, or you can press pause. But I did that a lot with German. So I watched Branagh's Hamlet, and I would watch it with them speaking in English and reading the German. Then I would watch them speaking in German and reading the German. And then I would have them speaking in German and read the English. And that, not just with Hamlet, but with lots of movies. But I would try to watch them several times in those variations to get the biggest, fullest possible picture. And by the way, memorizing Shakespeare, I mean, I swear to God, you haven't read Shakespeare until you've read him in German, which is a little bit of a joke from Star Trek 6, I think it was. You haven't read Shakespeare until you've read him in the original Klingon. But yeah, it sounds so much cooler in German. Aus nichts kann nichts entspringen. From nothing can nothing come, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's really important. And then speaking, even though you don't feel like it, finding the courage to open your mouth. What do they call it in French? Amuse-bouche, I think. You got to amuse your mouth. You have to really relax your mouth, I find helps a lot of people. So I teach mouth relaxation yoga exercises to get yourself out of your mind so that you can just let your mouth and get feedback, hearing yourself get into place. Recording yourself. There's a technique called echoing, some people call it, where let's say you take a snippet from a movie or a recording and you use Audacity and you record yourself and you just compare yourself and you try to fix it over time. Mirroring, some people also call it. That can be quite useful for attuning yourself. I'm quite bad at that area overall because I'm about 80% deaf in this ear. So I have to really try and make sure I hear things correctly and try to model them and hear myself. And I still have a bit of a disadvantage in the pronunciation error, apparently in English, because I'm always corrected by people how I say certain English things. But yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell, really. And I would say it's the same thing with intermediate and advanced, although there you could use CEFR. So CEFR is, the European system with A1, A2, B2, C2, etc. And you can use those things to try and figure out what exactly you should be progressing towards. Most of us won't really need it because C2 gets into the level of reading very specific academic papers and so forth. But that may be the thing that you want to do and need to do.
Yeah, very interesting. What about grammar? Grammar is a subject about which there's much debate in language learning. Some people say, well, take Latin as an example, which you said you're developing your Latin again. I'm curious actually about what that means. Some people say, well, you must start with the grammar, go through Wheelock or something like that, learn the grammar tables, memorize them, amo, amas, amat, that sort of thing.
Yes, amamos.
Yeah, yes. And you approach the language that way. Sometimes people call that a kind of grammar translation method, or certainly where one front loads grammatical idea, rote memorization, and so on. Maybe that's the extreme version of that. And then other people will say, just to take another extreme, which was say, well, no, you should. We don't learn language like that when we're children. We don't memorize vocabulary tables, grammar tables, and so on. So what we need is a sort of natural immersion in the language. In Latin, the classic example is a book like Lingua Latina, natural method kind of approach. And their grammar is taught, when it is taught, in Latin. But mainly the idea is you'll absorb the Latin through lots and lots of input. And some people take that even further, in fact. And I know one person who's attempting to learn Latin, but just by reading lots and lots and lots of Latin. hoping that they will, 3 or 4 hours a day of reading, absorb and pick up the grammatical ideas. And maybe they'll circle around later on to get a more precise idea. So I think certain languages perhaps suit certain approaches better than others. But to take Latin as an example, there is the full range, I think, of ideas as to how to best approach learning it, particularly when it comes to grammar. Should we have it or not explicitly? And so on. What are your thoughts on grammar?
Well, in Latin, I mean, it's going to be very important because you're very unlikely to be speaking it with lots of people where you're going to observe how it plays out. Let's just forget about rules, but there's going to be a way the game is played that you can observe naturally, and it can rub off on you. So yeah, I have to study grammar tables and know things about ablative and vocative and all that kind of stuff, although those things less so in some cases. But the thing is you got to come back to, like, what is it you're trying to do? And I think there is a place for just reading lots of Latin. That's what I'm doing, but it's like reading selectively, and what am I reading and how am I reading it? So I read Bruno in Latin and I memorize some of it. And there is a way to analyze what's going on in the grammar without quite knowing what the rule is called. And you can make that one practice, which you interleave with the memorization of a table or what have you. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think it's really just a question of, why are you doing it? What is your goal? And then how are you going to optimize the time that you spend? So this is another area to talk about, which is interleaving. Well, I sort of said it with the levels of processing effect: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and then memorizing or remembering. And how exactly each person is going to play that out is up to them. But I can tell you, in Mandarin and in German, I spent zero time on grammar. It's just not necessary, simply because, well, I shouldn't say zero. That would be incorrect. 635 hours, in fact, I spent in a class in which I learned nothing. I learned some things, but and in Chinese class, they did touch upon it a little bit. But the reality is that I just went through the motions in order to pass the tests and all that sort of stuff. But I haven't ever used that knowledge, because you can just simply see how people are using things. I basically commit things to memory. It sometimes takes months before I'll even know what a word is in the sentence that I'm using, because I just won't. Why spend the time looking it up when it's a mission-oriented sort of thing? And there's a lot of particles in Mandarin that I have to be reminded to put them into sentences. Like when I'm speaking with my parents-in-law, I'll be reminded that, or they'll just repeat to me, and they'll repeat it with they're not articles exactly, but certain "de" is used in several ways for various purposes, and that's just cool with me. I mean, that's how my goal operates in that particular world. But to go and study it, you might want to, relative to your goal. And then it's just a question of where you place it in your practice. I would put it under reading practice. And then while you're reading, so there's a thing called anticipatory reading, for example, in the language learning world. And this is very beneficial, because as you're reading, you try to anticipate what it means ahead of time while you're reading. But you can also use anticipatory reading to anticipate what the grammar lesson might be here, and try to work it out as you're reading. In the same way in music, you'd be like, well, is this F Locrian? Well, how would I know? So you're anticipating what it might be, and then you answer the question, because how would you know is easy to answer. There's a book for that, or there's some web page that's going to explain, yes, that was F Locrian or whatever. Insofar as music and language work together, I mean, I think that's exactly what it is. The modes and grammar have a very deep relationship to them. There's all kinds of people who can solo, and they won't even know what they're doing necessarily, that they're just going to now give a lecture on limited hexaphonic transpositions or, or whatever in some obscure music theory. They're just not. They're going to use it. And there's lots of people who are quite fluent in languages who couldn't tell you for the life of them what's going on. I've had this where I've tried to show off my German to certain people, and I'll ask a native speaker, "Is that right? Is that whatever I'm trying to demonstrate that I understand?" They're like, "Keine Ahnung," which means no idea. So, yeah, it comes down to your goal. Do you want to be a grammarian? Bruno said that the grammarians are constantly using their power to demean and belittle you, and they often don't quite understand even as much as they think. So yeah, grammar is in the great apothecary or pharmacy of language. It's a poison that cures and a cure that poisons.
Do you make a differentiation between a language such as Latin or Sanskrit and the sorts of purposes you're putting those languages to, and a language, say, like a language like Mandarin and German and so on?
Yeah, definitely. Because in the cases of German Mandarin, there was speaking as a goal. In Hebrew, there's no interest in speaking for that particular goal. With Sanskrit, no interest in speaking. With Latin, I really don't know who I would speak Latin with. So it doesn't really have that involved. But when I did German and Mandarin, there was speaking involved. So that had to really be a huge part of it. But that said, with all those other experiences, I don't know, I just knew intuitively to speak Hebrew out loud when I was memorizing. But I still, when I play around with Latin, I make sure I read it out loud, just because I know of the memory benefits and also the comprehension benefits, better said, and anticipatory reading kind of gets interrupted when you're reading out loud, but you can always read again and do the thinking process. But I totally approach everything differently, and always keep in mind that you have to create a game that you're going to be satisfied that you played it that way, or keep Kierkegaard in mind, who said, do it this way or do it that way. Other way, you'll regret it. That sort of thing. And just try to play it in such a way that you won't fall into Kierkegaard's trap and you won't regret it. And I think that always comes back to, like, why are you doing it? Do you have sufficient number of reasons why? And then if you're going to do it in a way that satisfies the goal. And then your relationship to language and what it is and how you can learn it can be such a blissful thing, but it can also be utter suffering and torment. And that's a very sad thing, especially when you realize the more you putter around with languages and the more you spend significant time with languages, is that there's not that much difference on the other end, not nearly as much as you imagine. Like, a lot of people think there's going to be this whole new world on the other end. But really what you find, or at least my experience is that the majority of people still only have meaningless small talk. And most of that small talk won't be interesting to you. And most of those books are books that you weren't going to read in your mother tongue, even if they were translated. And, so you have to, if you've set the goal appropriately, that won't sting so much. Right? Especially if you're a kind of person prone to being by yourself, having deep intellectual concerns, that sort of stuff that I imagine many of us share. It's just on the other end, unless you take a lot of joy out of small talk, which I don't, then there's a ringing emptiness in every area of the world. And I see this with a lot of my students. They find, well, I've moved all the way to this country and I've learned, and now I want to go to the next one because, I found out that there's nobody to talk to about these things that I find so interesting. And I've been there, it's just, Germany is a little bit of an exception to the rule, but that is something I found in Mandarin. Like, there's really not, I wasn't able in that language to find people who wanted to talk about the things that I wanted to talk to and they really wanted to talk about things that I have no interest in talking about. So, when my wife said that thing to me, I was just like, oh, okay, then, I was neither happy or sad about it. It was just kind of like, yeah, she doesn't care, you know? So, and she doesn't talk philosophy with me in English anyway.
When you were doing your German kind of breakthrough, when you had that paradigm shift and you were really reading a lot, how much were you reading a day? Did you do it by time or pages, or how did you measure that? And what was your regime at that time of breakthrough in German?
Oh, I tried to read like everything in German that I could, but I paid special attention, as I say, to interviews and then finding books that interested me, which is quite difficult because I'm very interested in Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann and like all these people. But that didn't mean I enjoyed reading them in German. Like Hesse is great and Siddhartha is not that complicated in German, but it's not necessarily going to lead to the speaking part. You know, help with the way the language actually operates in the 21st century and how people use it. So I had to kind of correct my attitude because I was doing a lot of that. I was like reading the classics and all this sort of stuff. And then I finally realized, along with or some distance after the musician thing, I could do the musician interview thing with novels. So what were the kinds of novels that I was actually going to sit through? And that was a bit of a challenge because, as I just mentioned, like most of the books that are in another language, you wouldn't want to read them even in translation in your own language. So I made it a bit of a mission to find native or language novels written in German that would reflect as closely as possible the language as spoken by the kinds of people that I wanted to be speaking with. And so that took some effort, but then finding those books, then it's just like, how much time can I spend reading? You know, like it's not, I have to make myself read. It's just like, this is amazing. And then you just keep reading it in the same way, you know, oh, I'm reading Philip K. Dick. I can't believe that Valis actually exists. Like this is blowing my mind. I don't know that I would want to read a German translation of Valis, but you know, if I'm interested in it, I don't care. I'll push through it. Same thing with Bruno. Like it's not easy, but I'll read it because it's Bruno, you know, that sort of thing. I think Bruno is more interesting for me to read than Seneca, although I also read some Seneca. But the thing is that I think Stoicism is just not my bag. But Bruno is whatever Bruno is, you know. So it's easier to do the reading. Plautus is more interesting dramatically than Seneca. So you know, just find the thing is what I've always tried to figure out, and then you don't have to worry about like, well, is it 4 hours or whatever. But as a general thing, every day. Same thing when I was working for my Mandarin test, every day, whether I feel like it or not, because you need the pattern recognition, and it's a natural spaced repetition that doesn't have to involve memory palaces, but because memory palaces are in play, you're amplifying the natural spaced repetition. And I was very happy with my performance on that exam for Mandarin because I only got one question wrong. And I think that the reason I got that question wrong is because the exam was at 6 p.m, which is not my favorite time to take exams because I'm quite tired as a person who tends to get up at 4:30 or even earlier in the morning. So I was astonished I even got anything right, quite frankly. So yeah, reading should take care of itself if you get your why together and you read stuff that's genuinely interesting to you. And you do the memory work so that you can start to follow the plot.
You're emphasizing here this idea of finding your why and letting that, your goal, mission-oriented, as you said, direct your path of study and even what you read, what you study, etc. And of course, that's quite, in some way, it seems quite commonsensical. But on the other hand, a lot of language learning is not done that way. It's well, this is the, as you say, a frequency list of vocabulary. This is the fastest way to absorb this, that, and the other, and so on. So in a sense, one goes through a very boiled down, impersonal process in the name of efficiency.
Yes.
But you're saying here that may actually, if it works at all, you may end up arriving not that much closer to where you wanted to end up anyway, and you'll have to go and do the other process anyway.
Yeah. Well, let me be that rare figure who's just another schmuck with something to sell, who knows that that's what he is, and point my finger at my own industry, right? It's not very profitable to tell somebody, the way you really do it is you buck up and you take some responsibility for your own journey and you stop buying the next shiny object. You pick one book, you go through it thoroughly until it's done, and you don't look at another one until that first one is done. And you get one audio program and you don't look at another one until that one is done. And you really I'd be a much more successful schmuck with something to sell if I would just do it the way the other people do. But it's just not that profitable. What you have to do is you have to have this thing where you don't really have to think and you don't have to be particularly personally involved. We're just going to give you all the lessons and all the lists of the words, and we're going to give you all the exercises, and that's the way that it's going to be. There's like no responsibility at all, like in terms of encouraging an individual to take the adventure by the reins and put some spurs on and kick yourself a little bit into action, and it's a longer story how that I even know to do that to myself. But Mandarin, the Mandarin character book was on the floor every morning so that I saw it, and if I was going to not practice that morning, I made sure that I knew that it was the choice that I made. And then when I practiced, it went on the pillow, but it also went on the pillow if I didn't practice that morning, because I wanted to make sure that I knew I was the guy who was missing the goal that day. It is a personal responsibility thing in a world where it's far too profitable to remove that from the equation. And if you think about all the softwares, oh, well, we'll give you some coins. We'll give you some leaderboards and all this. I've been to several of the polyglot conferences where I've presented about memory techniques for language learning in particular. And there's all kinds of people who came up to me and they asked me, and they're just like, I have top prize on software X. I've passed all the levels, but I can't speak the language. And I said, well, did you read, write, speak, and listen in ample doses while you were playing around in there? And I don't want to name any names in particular, but if you look at some of the actual science papers that some of these softwares refer to in their marketing or wherever they hide on their site, according to Science X, those papers often, if ever, actually say what they are saying that they say, So there's a big ruse going on. And yes, you can have what's called near transfer effects. And they're based on context-dependent memory or state-dependent memory, where you can literally have remembered more when you're in the context of the game and have none of it transfer to reality. And that's a tragedy that so many people are caught in this loop. And it's a dopamine loop, so to speak. I mean, there's a lot more going on than dopamine spikes, but their behavior is being trained through confirmation biases and recency biases and all these problems to think that more is going on than it is. And it's a confusing activity with accomplishment. And the problem with that is I can't tell you what your accomplishment should be. You have to tell me what it is. And then, we can talk about what is going to be the path, because there's more than one way to tackle this beast, except for there's really only one way. But there's, different ways to think about the one way that you're going to travel. And I find it a very strange environment that we're in. I've called it out, I believe, since the very beginning. I called it out even by the title of my first book, which was How to Learn and Memorize German Vocabulary. And a lot of people have said, well, I didn't learn any German from this. And I said, did you read the title? Because it never was about learning German. It's about how to learn and memorize the vocabulary, but that hasn't been particularly rewarding, to call a spade a spade. And a lot of people just have false impressions in their mind. And I think we know a lot about why false impressions are created in the mind, but what to do about it is very unclear, other than just to call a spade whenever you have the opportunity.
We've talked about grammar. And let's talk a bit about vocabulary then. You've mentioned your first book, How to Memorize German Vocabulary. One thing I'm particularly interested in is how you go about memorizing vocabulary. And also, when would you, I suppose this applies to both grammar and vocabulary, when would you begin to employ things like a memory palace? For example, we rattled off a little bit of the Latin verbal table there, amo, amas, amat, and that sort of thing, amamos, amatus, amat. And so a bit of repetition or recitation of that for a few minutes each day, probably within a week it's in there. I don't know. You know, I mean, how?
Oh, I would want it in 5 minutes. I mean, it shouldn't take that long. But let me correct myself though. If you have memory techniques on your side, it shouldn't take that long.
Right.
So there's different people who approach it very, very differently, and you kind of want to peg your hopes, I guess, on someone who's closer to the goal that you're achieving than someone who isn't when you can, but then also take it with a grain of salt. Because one of my Latin teachers that I've looked at and learned from, it's like, repeat this table 500 times. That's what I did, right? And then I just thought, yeah, but why? Because I can memorize that quite reasonably well in 2 to 5 minutes. So that's how you memorize vocabulary, is exactly how you memorize, what was it, Julius Caesar that we were doing, you know? Now, the thing is that I haven't continued to remember that line from Julius Caesar that we worked at because I didn't go through the ropes of long-term memory. But, you know, I have memorized some of Bruno in Latin, so abit ergo chaos non figuram non statuam, you know, like that sort of stuff, right? Why that I can still recall it and not Julius Caesar is because of the memory palace and how the memory palace is used. And whatever I may have memorized, if it stays in long-term memory, it is usually because of having put the material through the ropes. So when it comes to language learning, the only difference is reading, writing, speaking, and listening in ample doses. That's what kind of reduces the amount you have to memorize, because a lot is just going to come along for the ride. But if someone wants to try a very modular approach, I will just share with you what I came up with, which at that time was just in the air in my mind. And later I found pretty much in Aristotle and pretty much in the tradition all along, which is, I was sitting in Berlin one day on the balcony, and I had what's called a monolingual dictionary. And it was Deutsch als Fremdwörter, I think. So German as a foreign language, or Fremdsprache, better said, sorry. So Deutsch als Fremdsprache, German as a foreign language. And what a monolingual dictionary is it has the definitions in German. And in that case, it's friendly definitions for someone who's learning the language. So it's not, you know, super insular, but something that you could read basically with an 850 word vocabulary. Anyway, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I had one memory palace for every letter of the alphabet? And then I would just rack and stack a bunch of these words per alphabet letter, and then I would add a sentence to them after I established the core word. Here's where grammar is a little bit interesting, because there's trennbare Verben and all this kind of stuff in German where you have to like split part of the word and stick it at the end. Worry about that later. The whole thing is, and in those sentence examples, they'll often, you know, that's exactly what you'll see, which you can observe rather than learning the rule. You could just say, whoa, that's how that works, you know, and then you look up the rule and educate yourself about it however you wish. But nonetheless, one alphabet for every letter of the alphabet. And then I started to notice, wait a second, a lot of these words start with AB. Well, that's Abraham Lincoln. So in a memory palace, Abraham Lincoln can be going from this station to this station to this station, and I have to do less mnemonic images, and I get more out of it, because here he's doing something with art, here he's biting something, so ab artisch, ab bites mitteln, like he's doing stuff that's different, but it's still Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And there's a bunch of ein words, there's a bunch of ser words, there's a bunch of zu words, there's a bunch of ver words, or fair, F-E-R, or sorry, V-E-R, and so on. So, you know, I can have Vera for fair words, F-E-R words, or V-E-R, sorry. And I can have Einstein for ein words. I can have Zorro for zu words, even though Zorro is Z-O. I couldn't think of someone for Z-U, so that sort of thing, and play around with it. And the next thing you know, it's just watching Zorro move through a memory palace, just racking on all these words. So just to keep it simple, because it is, 10 words in a memory palace becomes 100 or so, maybe it's 70, when you add a phrase to every single word. In the exact same way we took the first word of the Julius Caesar passage, and then we just added some more words, to where it was. And then you're reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and you're taking on that discipline of not overwhelming yourself. Wow, these 3 words are really interesting to me. Those are the ones I'll memorize. And you keep building your vocabulary, interleaving reading with some memorization and so forth. And it scales quite quickly to the point that, there's a lot of bad stuff in the marketing, but there's also some good people. Like when Benny Lewis says you can get to basic fluency in 3 months. This is true. You can definitely do it. And this is one way how. He memorizes things a little bit differently, but he does use mnemonics, and it's kind of the same principle, just looked at differently. He would rather start at the sentence, or as far as I understand, he often likes to just start at the level of the sentence. I like to start at the level of the word, maybe because I'm a reader. I don't know, but nonetheless, within a week or 2 weeks, if you spend 15 minutes a day, 26 memory palaces, 1 for every letter of the alphabet, or whatever your language demands, because Ukrainian or Russian is going to have more. Italian is going to have less. Whatever it is. You could have, just use the English example, because this is useful to do in your own mother tongue. 10 memory palaces, 26 memory palaces, 10 words in each, 260 words. That's a boost. That's a substantial boost. How are you going to retain it over time? That comes back to reading, writing, speaking, and listening, which is what a lot of people don't actually want to do. They just want to know the language, and they want to have it like on tap, just turn on and off. But recently, a guy came to visit me here in Sunshine Coast. He had read one of my books, and he was from Germany, and we were hanging out. And at one point, he was trying to say something, and I said, I can understand German, so have at it. And then we started to speak German from that point on. And he told me something very interesting, which I know is reflected in memory science. He said, it took you about 15 to 20 minutes. And at first I was a little doubtful, how good your German was. But it was like after about 15, 20 minutes, it was like watching you grow it to life. And that's exactly right, because linguistic deskilling is a thing. Anything that you grow into a bush, let's say, or a series of rows in a farm, has a decay if you don't keep fertilizing it and so forth. But strangely enough, if you've gotten to a certain amount, the cognitive reserve has been developed. You can watch it yourself turn on as it comes back to life, and not as completely as it was. But he remarked upon that, and I was just like, yeah, that I observed it too. I was constantly amazed by how these words were springing out of me that I hadn't used for 7 years. So yeah, but that's the long and short of it, really.
Yeah, fascinating. 2 other just little points to tease out of what you've said. First of all, the state in which you learn. You've talked about interest being important, and I wonder if you might say something, if there is more to say about that. Often I think people experience language learning in the context of a test. Got to learn this vocabulary list or this grammar table or whatever it is for a certain test that's coming up. And then there's pressure, there's stress, etc. Is that a good thing? Does that help? Is that motivating? Or if one follows one's interests and passion, is that a better learning environment? So I'm curious about that, what effect the state one is in has on the learning process. And then the other point to tease out is maintaining. What do you do to maintain the languages that you've studied? So I'm curious about that. So 2 rather different but final points from me.
I think tests are potentially very useful for certain people, but they can also be a deal breaker because they can create so much stress and so forth. So I've had it both ways. And, when I was first in Brisbane and talking with my in-laws almost every day, in Mandarin. And then I thought, we walked past the Confucius Institute one day on the campus at QUT, and I was just like, they've got classes? Like, yeah, I was so excited. And the test, the idea that you get a certificate at the end, that was tremendously motivating, partly because I was enjoying speaking, especially with my father-in-law so much. And also there was this kind of excitement. Like, it would be really cool to share this with people and then see what kinds of things that I'd be able to share, because I had to do a lot of characters, which I hadn't worked on at that time. And the whole class was mainly in characters written on the board, and then the test was all character based. So that was tremendously motivating in that context. But in other contexts, I've had it where it's just really a drag, to have to do anything in order to be able to get a visa, for example, to get an Aufenthaltstitel, as they call it in Germany. You just had to go through the class and pass the exam. And so, I was being dramatic when I said I didn't learn anything. I did. I passed those tests. But it was a drag. It was a drag each and every minute of it. And part of it was that it was mandated. It had to be taken. And also the students there weren't that serious about it. And I picked up more, I don't remember any of it, but I picked up more Russian in that class than I did German, because all the students were like myself. They were there for a goal that they didn't really want, that they needed it in order to get to this other place. So it had nothing to do with a love or interest in the language. So yeah, it can go either way. And I think that it comes back to the finding out why you're doing the thing, and then how can you situate it so that it has its own excitement. It has its own happy chemical inducing scenario, which has a lot to do with extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation and a whole discussion around that sort of stuff. But basically, you just engineer yourself, and to a certain extent, and you can make illusions, helpful fictions. If I pass this exam, I will get such and such a prize that I give to myself, and if I don't, I will not punish myself too badly, or what have you. I'll just take it again, and then I'll get a bigger prize, whatever it is. I mean, you just manipulate yourself, basically. But if I were the boss of the world, I would probably just remove exams completely, for lots and lots of reasons. I think that if you can't make your own tests, well, we see we see all around us that there are people who just make their own tests, and that is an interesting phenomenon. And those who are subject to all kinds of tests also, that is an interesting phenomenon.
And the maintaining.
Oh, yes. Well, maintaining, I do a lot of reading still in German as much as I can. Watch movies in German. They don't have to be from Germany to watch. For some reason, Austrian German sounds so much softer and delightful in many ways, especially if you've been there and just talked with the people. But in the movies also, I notice it. And I try to push the limits a little bit, because one thing that just utterly fascinates me is that having learned German does not mean having learned all German kinds of German. So I'll sometimes watch a movie and I'll be like, why is it that I can't understand a single word about this? And it may be Plattdeutsch or have all kinds of whatever, maybe from some neighborhood in Hamburg or whatever. And they're not even saying Hamburg, they're saying Hamburg. And you have to think, like, what on earth is going on here? And it's the same thing with Mandarin also. Like, I'll still try to watch movies maybe once a month or something like that. And sometimes I'll understand just a certain amount. And other times I will understand nothing whatsoever. It's really wild, but it's cool to just keep up that exposure. And I don't seek as much as I should ongoing conversations in German to keep up Mundlich, as it's called, mouth German, the ability to speak. But I do have these sometimes visits from people, and then I'll be able to speak it. I find that as I age, it gets especially awkward when I see people or hear people on the bus speaking German, and then it's just like I'm a weird, strange old dude who's now all of a sudden talking to them. Because when I was younger, it wasn't that weird. I wasn't that much older than them, So I engaged less, which may be to my detriment. I don't know, but I'm just a little bit aware of the creep factor involved in that, at least the potential for it. But I maintain mostly by reading and listening to a lot of music. I mean, I mentioned Einstürzende Neubauten earlier. They just dropped a new album, and I take every opportunity to do that. And I'll take deep dives on certain topics that are in the language. So reading about Kraftwerk right now, and get lots of German going that way. Oh, and another thing, here's what might interest people. There's a thing called laddering. So I think ChatGPT is generally not a great idea for language learning, but where it can be useful is laddering. So I spent some time asking ChatGPT to give me lessons in Latin in German. So I take the lessons in German that it can produce for me, but I found that there's so many inaccuracies that it just pointed me to ladder in a different way, which is to find textbooks in Latin in German, which is actually how I started with Mandarin. I got a book in German so that I was learning Mandarin from a German textbook. But that's called laddering, and that's a thing that you can do. And in the early days of ChatGPT, it was a little more accurate, but it seems to have gotten less and less accurate as it trains itself on itself. But still, if you're willing to look up the phrases and the vocabulary that it produces for you to check that it's actually correct, it can still be quite useful. But I would only suggest using it if you're going to ladder. So if you know one language and you're learning another, get it to talk to you in the language you already know and give you some practice or just whatever portal laddering to another language. But you can do that manually as well, because that's quite useful. It gives your brain a good workout to learn one language in an acquired language that you've already done enough in to be able to do that. It's a way of maintaining, in other words, what I'm saying. I've done some maintenance work of German by learning Latin and learning Mandarin from German texts about those languages.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences with language learning. Anthony Metivier, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.